What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Neverwinter Nights 2, specifically the Complete Edition, which basically just means it has all the DLC. Now, I've previously reviewed Neverwinter Nights 1, so I had a bit of an idea of what to expect here, but nonetheless, there are some significant changes with Neverwinter Nights 2, and quite a few things I'd like to talk about in this video specifically. For starters, if you know anything about the original Neverwinter, while it does have a sort of main campaign and story modules, it was more of a platform for people to make their own adventures using D&D 3rd Edition, and there are a lot of persistent worlds and everything, as well as plenty of options to kind of play through other people's creations. And while some of that still holds true for Neverwinter Nights 2, it's not nearly to that extent, especially since Neverwinter has gotten a proper enhanced edition, whereas Neverwinter Nights 2 has not. You can only get 2 on GOG.com. It's not even available on Steam. Which brings me to one of my first points. If you're a regular watcher of the channel, I usually go through Steam a lot, and I use it to let people see my Steam profile for when I review games after 100%. However, in this case, because I have to go through GOG, that's not really possible, and in these cases, I usually just label them as reviews when I get to that part. But what's more, for this game in particular, because it's a bit on the older side, the servers have long since shut down, or at least the official ones. You can still connect to persistent worlds as well as download modules for the game. However, it is much harder to do. You have to download mods and everything to sort of restore this functionality. And even once you do that, there's really only a handful of active persistent worlds left at this point. And even just like playing other modules outside of the main ones is essentially like downloading a mod at this point and having to install it yourself. Which brings me to my next point I wanted to talk about. The GOG version of this particular game runs great. I haven't really had any problems on PC outside of the display settings being a little funky. It didn't want to go into higher resolutions right away. I had to kind of fiddle with it a lot and like toggle full screen and everything to get it to work. But beyond that, it's run very smooth. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's actually start talking about the game a little bit. Now, Neverwinter Nights 2 is unique in that it is one of, I think, 2 games, Icewind Dale 2 being the other one, that actually uses D&D 3.5 edition. If you follow this channel a lot, or just like these kind of games, you might be aware that I cover Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous and Pathfinder in general a lot. Pathfinder was actually based off of D&D 3.5, which means if you watch my Pathfinder content, you should actually be quite familiar with D&D 3.5. It's a version of D&D that is a personal favorite, and one that I played in high school in the tabletop version quite a bit, actually. So it's a system I'm very familiar with. So when I brought up character creation and saw all the options, a lot of memories came flooded back. And Neverwinter Nights uses 3rd edition, but 3.5 is significantly different than just baseline 3rd edition. And honestly, because of my familiarity with 3.5, so far the game has been a breeze. I started on normal and actually had to tick up the difficulty a little bit because it was just a little too easy, frankly. But character creation itself does work largely the same way it did in Neverwinter. You basically pick the important parts, your race. There's a lot more options here. You can play as some of the plains-touched races like Asamar Tiefling, the Genasi. You can play a Yuan-Ti Pureblood, which has been a personal favorite of mine, though a lot of the stronger races do actually start with a bit of a level kneecap in that they're a level or 2 behind everyone else, and this is done by causing the first level they gain to require more experience until they get past that initial barrier. And then after that, the experience turns back to normal, it seems. But so far, playing with a Yuan-Ti Warlock, I've not really had a problem with this in any way, and it hasn't really slowed me down, but something to know for sure. From here, it's probably important to mention the actual campaign modules. So the 4 main campaigns for the game are the actual base main campaign, the expansion, Mask of the Betrayer, which is the one everyone tells me is amazing, so I'm excited to see that one in particular. And then there are 2 others, another base campaign and a sequel to it, Storms of Zahir, and then the follow-up Mysteries in Westgate. I don't know too much about those, truth be told. I've never really heard about them, but everyone tells me all about Mask of the Betrayer and how amazing it is. But nonetheless, those are the sort of 4 base campaigns. And jumping into the first campaign, I gotta say I'm a pretty big fan of the way they handled the tutorial, because it introduces you as the foster son of a person living in a village. The tutorial is actually just sort of you taking part in a celebration of sorts that sees you testing your skills against other villagers in an attempt to win the prize for the day, which is honestly a pretty cool way to play the tutorial. And then once that part ends, the actual game starts by the village being attacked. And I kind of like the way they wove the tutorial in there and kind of tried to make you feel a part of this village in a way. A simple thing, but I enjoyed it. Now, beyond that, quickly becomes apparent that the village was attacked specifically because they were looking for something that your father had, or hid more aptly. So you fend off the attack, your father sends you to Neverwinter after retrieving the item that he hid. Outside of that, the story is a bit of a mystery. However, I've heard the base campaign is kind of whatever. I don't know. I haven't heard a lot of negative about it, but not exactly a lot of positive either. So I'm curious where it's going to go. And in terms of gameplay, it does kind of seem to just be a straight upgrade from Neverwinter specifically. A lot of the features are simply more refined outside of obviously just looking better. Now, some of this is almost certainly my preference for D&D 3.5 as opposed to 3rd edition, but a lot of things are simply more intuitive in Neverwinter Nights 2, and the information, especially in the tutorial, definitely seems to be presented in a much clearer way at the same time. Now, moving on from there, I did want to mention kind of one last thing before we wrap up this video and save some things for the review, but this particular game was actually made entirely by Obsidian, whereas I believe Neverwinter Nights was a project between BioWare and Obsidian. And I mention that because this main campaign here does seem to have companions that actually have a proper story and a sort of reputation system with you, and I'm kind of curious to see how fleshed out that actually becomes, especially in comparison to the first game where the characters you adventured with in the main campaign for the first game were really more just set dressing. Really, they had a story, but it was relatively uninvolved. Whereas this particular bit, just the little bit I've messed around with it, definitely seems to try to put more of an emphasis on these people, so I'm curious to see how that actually winds up panning out. And one more thing before I leave you guys, I recently acquired a Steam Deck, and one of the things I plan on doing with it is adding notes to these reviews, specifically with the Steam Deck in mind, how games run, etc. And I mention this because with Neverwinter Nights 2 in particular, I was excited to try that game on the Steam Deck specifically because it's a non-Steam game. So I was very curious to see how easy it was to kind of just get it running on the Steam Deck, and it's a bit of a mixed bag because on one hand, the positive side, the game runs amazing on Steam Deck. In fact, I should have some footage of it running on Steam Deck to show you right now. However, getting it installed on the Steam Deck and working is a pain. The installation isn't so bad, however, actually getting it running requires switching to desktop mode and downloading several other various things that essentially allow the game to run in a sort of compatibility mode to enable it to actually work. But if you can get past all of that, which thanks to a pretty handy guide on Reddit genuinely wasn't so bad, but nonetheless does take like an hour or so, you can actually play the game on the Steam Deck, which I thought was really cool and I wanted to share in this part. To sum up my experience with Neverwinter Nights 2 as a first impressions, overall, I'm honestly loving it so far. It's always kind of a bummer to see the more popular stuff like the persistent worlds and the modules be harder to obtain in today's day and age. But beyond that, huge fan. I love D&D 3.5, so I'm very accustomed to the system and I'm looking forward to playing it, as well as several of the races and everything that you don't typically get to play in these kind of games that are in Neverwinter Nights 2 throughout their modules and campaigns. Combine that with the gameplay actually being quite the step up from Neverwinter Nights 1, again with a lot of my favorite additions from D&D being added to this edition. It's been a blast, and exploring the world seems to actually be a bit of exploration, at least in the base campaign. There are areas you can go and explore and solve quests. There seem to be a few options available, and to sum it up, my impressions of Neverwinter Nights 2 off the bat here, very positive. I'm loving what I'm seeing. I'm curious if the game can hold my attention long term, or if I start to see cracks in this relatively older game. But so far, having a blast, and I'm looking forward to knocking this one out for you guys and delivering a proper review. That's all I've got for you guys today. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.